what is this? What is this even? You'll hear from the forums of different perspectives, and I said a little bit of this before we started, but it was almost we represent different bits of different organizations, small, large, old, young, whatever else, which have been working on things separately, but we just feel there's kind of like been some crossover in the middle where we don't know exactly what it's going to be, but we feel it's kind of interesting. We want to kind of like expand that to see who else finds it interesting, and also what we don't know, and we know we don't know lots of things. So you hear from me, Rob, Lizzie, and Andy. Me first. So essentially, I've only really been thinking about this for about 6 months, maybe 7. So as I said like before, I feel that I'm really late to this, but then again, everyone's really late to this. Doing things is much better than not doing things. So I started, and it really sort of like came out the back of this UNDP work I've been doing on sort of like helping them build a future trends and signal system. And I felt like I was staring into the untempered schism. It was kind of like just coming out the back of that felt very much like sort of like, oh my God, the existential dread of having to do more than I was actually doing was very real. So I started off just by noticing the way that these two words were increasingly used, sustainable and regenerative. And I just found it really interesting because of the phrasing that people would say, we have to move beyond sustainability to the regenerative, beyond sustainability, which is interesting because that's a spatial metaphor and a temporal one. But whatever it means, it means through. You go, we have to go through sustainability to get to regenerative. So once you get to sustainability, then we're moving beyond sustainability, which is kind of like I didn't wholly agree with. So just in the number of times I kept bumping into it, because and I felt it was a little bit like Taleb's anti-fragile idea, where you go, this is not the opposite thing. Sustainable is maybe not the opposite to sustainable. So just started playing around with some concepts with this. So sustainable is fragile. So you have a model and you know that various bits of it are, they don't like the change that is coming. The sustainable is taking that model and just making it more robust, thinking of sort of inside the model itself. How do I consolidate some of the things? How do I make them better? How do I improve all these things that are within our domain, within our grasp? Whereas the regenerative feels like sort of like, okay, of what we have, what else is it part of? And what does it connect with? And how does it become bigger to be part of something that might not look like what we have at the moment at all? It might be wholly different. And there's no reason to suggest that we have to go there to come to here. And it's context specific, of course, but sometimes sustainability from unsustainable is about resisting change. It's like, I just want to do the thing we're doing, but, a bit better, get up to the sort of the idea of sort of, we'll just change everything that we can to be able to do this thing in a bit of a better way. Whereas the regenerative is embracing change from now. To think about sort of like, actually, we don't have to go here first, because the more you go here to kind of like consolidate the model we have might prevent us in the long run going to embrace the change of the model we need. So as a headline summary of that kind of like train of thought, it's, if sustainable is arguably about the impact our action is having, the regenerative is the impact we're having on action, and not just our own action, the action around us and the action that we have connecting with in various different ways by taking these constituent parts and broadening them out. So, cue research training montage 7 months ago, just going, oh, must read lots of things, find lots of things, and so on, which is where I bumped into the RSA things.
Oh yeah. So yeah. Hello everyone. So I thought I'd just introduce you to what the RSA has been up to, really, and like see where it does and doesn't maybe overlap with some of what John's been doing. So yeah, there's a little bit of a sort of thread of questions we've been going on in the last sort of 12 to 18 months that's led us to a sort of capabilities framework. Like what skills, what mindsets do we need to embrace a more regenerative approach? And yeah, I thought it would be valuable to tell that through a series of questions, given that we're all about the questions today. So the biggest question we've got at the RSA, the sort of meta question that I guess keeps us motivated, which is around how do we enable people, places, and the planet to flourish. So this is our mission, and there's some clues. Obviously, that's a difficult to answer question. There are some clues about what we believe at the RSA are the sort of the direction of travel you should go in to think about how you overcome that that scale of challenge. So for us, it's around enabling people to fulfill their potential and contributing to regenerative futures. So basically, people are at the heart of some of that transformation that we need to go on. And then there's that word again, regenerative. Like, so what do we mean by regenerative? And, you know, how do we really get people to fulfill the potential in a way that leads towards that those sort of outcomes? Well, the questions we've been sort of zooming in on, and again, we sort of whittle these down over the course of the last like 12 months or so, is around what is it going to take if we need to shift to a regenerative system, a regenerative world, then the economics behind what a regenerative economy are going to be really important. If we're talking about the leverage points for change, it feels like we do need to massively reorientate the system itself so that a regenerative economy can flourish. So, yeah, we believe that we're going to need a lot of redesign of things, a lot of innovation of things. And it's probably not an end state. We do know that this is going to be a constant evolution of stuff. But again, zooming in on that idea of what is it that if we need quite a bit of transformation to get to this state, what is it that people are going to need? And so we start to get a lot closer to where we've been heading recently, which is around there's a role to play in skills and learning and development through this era of transformation. So what does that look like? And I think some useful quotes just to sort of set this in context is, you know, Zachary Stein would say that education is kind of the root of all the other crises as well, because the reason why we have climate change, why we have problems with governance and politics and wars and social unrest is probably because we're not really necessarily learning or developing in the ways that we should be developing for the future we want to bring about. And so you start to prompt questions around, well, what does education and learning mean? And not just in a formal setting, I suppose, as well. So here we're thinking about what is ongoing learning and development look like within organizations, within different companies, within business. And Chomsky talks about it as, you know, creative exploration, independence of thought, this willingness to cross frontiers and challenge beliefs. You know, that's very much returning in a way to the Enlightenment era view of what education and learning was around. It's not about indoctrinating people to the status quo. It's about sort of moving us forward. And then Sir Ken Robinson talks about using education and learning as this ability to expand our consciousness, our capabilities, our cultural understanding. And so what are the question that we've been sort of exploring in more detail is what are the capabilities required for the 21st century, for these people of tomorrow, as Carl Rogers would say. And we sort of did some research. We spoke to quite a lot of regenerative practitioners in the field and found that, you know, lots of our conversations get pulled. If you could think of this as a spectrum of sort of hard skills over here and these kind of softer, I mean, you'd even say soft skills, and then you're getting into mindsets, values, and worldviews like beliefs and attitudes, that we tend to focus our attention way too much on this end. So we all need green skills, or we all need to tackle AI as like the urgent priority. But actually, like, what we would suggest is there's this kind of fuzzy area in the middle where you need to start thinking about, well, how do we actually sort of build empathy to create the right sort of mindsets, values, and worldviews, or collaboration? So definitely much more on the softer end of the skills spectrum, and ideally leaning towards nourishing the kind of beliefs that are compatible with a regenerative future. And so I suppose one way of framing that we thought about is this transition from a life-centric perspective. I guess this could be planet-centric, whatever the label of du jour is. And actually, on reflection with, you know, John's provocation around, does regenerative go through sustainable? I sort of still, if I'm putting my skeptics hat on, I still have this slight concern around, does life-centric exist through human-centered? Actually, is that the right way of thinking about this? It feels quite Cartesian, it feels quite linear. So I think there are flaws in this kind of way of thinking, like just extending our existing models and building on top of them, I think is difficult for us to break out of. And at the RSA, we're still struggling to break out of that extension of existing models. And I won't read all this slide, there's a lot of words here, but I think we're ultimately saying that to get to the point where we can have life-centric cultures and civilizations, it's a radical shift from where we are today. It's moving, you know, what it means for organizations, what it means for individuals. It looks very, very different from even a sort of human-centered perspective of maybe where the progressive edge is for the last, you know, 10, 20 years or whatever. And ultimately, I've gone the long way around here, but this has kind of led us to a framework called the 10 Cs, which, you know, we should take a nod. Ken Robinson already came up with the 8 Cs. And when I introduced this to someone, they said, oh, great, you found 2 more. So the quiz at the end is like, find the 2 more that aren't Ken Robinson's 8 Cs. But yeah, these are the first 5. And you'd probably argue that actually, like, none of these are necessarily like new capabilities. We've been talking about these for many, many years. And I think it's around, for us, it's around how do you move them from individualistic expressions of these skills through to human-centered ones, through to life-centric ones. So it's almost like about how do we get to an amplification of how these capabilities and skills are used in practice day in, day out to make decisions that are much more, you know, higher level of consciousness in a way. And then here's the other 5, some of which are hidden. Compassion is that one. Oh, sorry, care is that one, actually. So yeah, this is the 10 Cs. And we're still on a journey at the RSA to work out, you know, what does this mean in practice? So at the moment, we're kind of redesigning our awards programs. I don't know if you're familiar with, we have pupil design awards, student design awards, and we're kind of redesigning all of that to sort of look at, like, how do we measure and incentivize and encourage these sorts of capabilities in that awards program for the future, a Design for Life program. So we're doing a lot of prototyping on that over the next, so 6 to 12 months to sort of find out where it leads. But this is very much still an open book, a prototype to be played with, which I think is where sort of John stepped in and started to have a play. And I will hand over to Lizzie. We have to do a tech switch quickly.
All good. Amazing. So also I apologize for background noise. So for context, I am at Schumacher College in Devon that some of you may know or have been to, and I'm doing the Masters in Regenerative Economics on the side of my day job, and have spent all morning democratizing finance. So I'm just kind of coming back into this space, but also it's lunchtime here and there are 4 master's programs and it might be noisy, so please wave at me if it is. So I guess the context for me and coming into this conversation, so I spent 15 years in the creative agency world, predominantly in digital service design, and then 7 years ago moved into the world of facilitation and leadership development, and had been thinking for a long time around what does it take to create change or help enable change or steward change. And I and everyone in my team had quite a strong perspective in terms of the kind of change that we wanted to enable, and had the opportunity at London Climate Action Week earlier this year to explore some ideas and bring people together, and that was kind of my reconnection to John and his work. And if it's possible to move to the next slide. Yeah, so this Maya Angelou quote, I think, has been my quote of the year of 2023. Do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. And I keep coming back to it, both in terms of like holding me personally to account, but actually more than that, of this reflection of why is it that we, and when I say we, I sort of mean collectively in organizations, and particularly in the private sector where I do most of my work, we know better, we are drowning in data, but the doing better seems to be a real problem. Can I go to my next slide? So this question of why aren't we doing better has really bothered me. And in my shift from being a craftsperson and making things to being an enabling person, I started to reflect on how organizations are run and what it means to be a leader in this particular context. So next slide. So I guess my hypothesis, and the hypothesis that we've been exploring at Curve, is thinking about a different kind of leadership in order for positive change to take root or occur. Slide. So I guess the moving away from the idea of leader as hero, and I hear it a lot. In fact, in almost every organization I go into, there's kind of this language of we need to move away from command and control, and people sort of say it very sincerely. And then I somewhat annoyingly ask, do you have people who are called directors, and do you have people whose job title is managers? Because the director's job is to command and the manager's job is to control. And I find it interesting how there's maybe different stories being told, but when we think about the language that we use and the organizational structures that we're operating in, almost unconsciously, these things are in tension and perhaps holding us back. So next slide. But also rejecting the kind of servant leadership. So, you know, over the last few years, there's been a lot more talk about leading from behind. And I was reflecting last year specifically about the number of female leaders in particular who were sort of very publicly leaving their roles, citing burnout, stress, frustration with not being able to do what they wanted to do. And it sort of reminded me, the best analogy I could come up with was, so I have two kids, and when they were little, like toddlers, I would say something like, let's go to the park, and they would say, I want to bring my doll's buggy, and I want to wear my butterfly wings, and I want to bring the snack bag and all of this stuff. And we'd finally make it out the house and we'd start walking to the park, and within 2 minutes one would say, I don't want to push the buggy anymore, I don't want to wear my wings anymore, I don't want to carry the snack bag. And we'd arrive at the park and I'd be carrying everything, and they'd sort of run off feeling like everything was amazing, and I'd just be like holding all of the stuff thinking, is it bedtime yet? And I guess my reflection on this idea of servant leadership is it's not helping people understand what their responsibility is. And in sort of the world of sustainability and regeneration, they do not see the externalities. Those are offloaded onto other people and into other spaces, and that feels like a problem. So next slide. I've sort of been playing with this idea of facilitator leadership, and this thinking is specifically inspired by two people, one of whom you might know, which is John Alexander, who wrote a brilliant book called Citizens, that if you haven't read, I would urge you to read it. He published it last year, which is moving from a story of consumption, the consumer story, to the citizen story. But also another friend and mentor of mine, Shelley Spiller, who is a Māori academic in New Zealand, who's done a lot of work with the traditional navigator community. And she wrote a brilliant book called Wayfinding Leadership. And in it, she talks about sort of the indigenous technology of not having maps or compasses or sextants, but having orientation markers, so having the moon and the stars and the waves and the wildlife and ancestral knowledge and the relationships with the people who are in the boat with you. And when one of those things is obscured, you have all of these other things to draw on. And my reflection, one of the sort of key ideas in her thinking, or in Māori thinking in general, there's this beautiful word, rangatira, which connotes leadership. And the word ranga means to interweave, and the word tira means a group of people on a journey together. And this idea of what it means to be a leader is to interweave this group of people who have a destination. It's not for nothing, it's purposeful. But one level deeper, which really helps me in terms of the usefulness or the utility of the metaphor, is so weaving is kind of central in Māori culture and is really important. But the most important thing in any piece of weaving is the tension. So if you don't have tension in your fibers, you don't have something that is strong and that is flexible and that is resilient. You might have fraying at the edges, but you have something which is inherently strong. Whereas if you have fibers or grains of wood that are in alignment, you have something that looks aesthetically pleasing, but is very brittle and can be torn apart or blown over. And so for me, I've been playing around with what does it look like when we show up as leaders and think of ourselves as facilitators, and as part of that, not qualitatively different from the group of people we're responsible for. We don't operate in a different plane, we're within and among. Can I go to the next slide? So this kind of led me to thinking about being here during London Climate Action Week last year as facilitator and weaving together conversations and people, and to see what emerged. And one of the conversations was with John and Adam, who's here online also, and a few other brilliant people to kind of test some of John's thinking, which I'd picked up on LinkedIn and maybe pushed him before he was ready to talk about it publicly. But it was a joy. It was a joy to do that. And so I guess coming back to because the session is a question about questions, there were a bunch of questions which came out of that week, but actually I'm still kind of carrying with me now, and even kind of being here in Schumacher. So one is, what is the difference between sustainability and regeneration, or being sustainable and regenerative, and why does that matter? So I think Adam, back in June in that conversation, pointed out that 30 years ago, these were the same things when we spoke about what it meant to have a sustainable society. We meant what we are now perhaps talking about when we say regenerative, but coming back to my command and control and directing and managing, I think language really, really matters, and whether we need to reclaim it, think about how we redefine things. I think that's an important use of time. The second thing is balancing short and long-term thinking, and I at least kind of swinging between what's the immediate tactical thing that I can be doing that feels useful, while also thinking about what are the long tail consequences of anything that we might choose to do now, and thinking in terms of complexity and complex systems. Whatever we're choosing to put out into the world is changing it, and is something that is likely to be hardened and amplified in ways that we perhaps might not anticipate. So how do we approach that? The third thing is, can we move from acting on the world to acting in it? So this is kind of inspired by, it's a little book called A Delicate Activism by Alan Kaplan, who, and it's kind of a case study of a piece of regenerative work in South Africa after apartheid. And what I love about this idea is essentially it says that traditional activism comes along with an instrumental point of view and says, we have a vision for a different way of being that we now need to impose onto the world. And what can often happen is accidentally we just reinforce existing systems and power dynamics. We just shuffle around who the people are and where they are. And that actually, what does it mean to act in the world? And to, I think, as design practitioners, that practice of using all of our senses to understand and observe and notice what's going on, and then respond to that, but without presuming that we know the future or that we have permission to impose our version on the future, but to be in the world rather than on it. And then finally, so for me, as within this course, I've sort of fallen into a rabbit hole of feminist relational theory and thinking about like private sphere characteristics of being interrelated and interdependent versus traditional public sphere characteristics, which are around separation and individuation, and sort of thinking about, what does it mean to be social actors and to privilege our relationships over individual objects or actors. And so for me, in really practical terms, this is how do we break out of a way of being together which is inherently competitive to something which is more cooperative and collaborative and really understands how, whether we like it or not, we are all connected, and making that real and tangible in kind of the spaces that I operate. I think that was everything.
Thank you, Lizzie. And I have to say, so that Lizzie bringing me here to kind of like speak about these things, as she said, before I was ready, is an underlying current of this. I think so. I don't think I wouldn't be thinking the things I'm doing, thinking the things I'm thinking, or doing the things I'm doing if it wasn't for Lizzie going, no, talk about this stuff earlier and open up. So it's an ongoing theme. This is part of the thing. But you begin to get a sense of beginning to spot various different things in different places. And if I have one modus operandi, it's everything is Lego. Everything you see comes apart at the seams. Anything you see as a construct, you can pull apart and go, oh, how do I remix it? How do I take some of these things and put them together in different ways? So starting with the 10 Cs from the RSA, I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then finding the Design Council's systemic design framework and going, okay, so we've got 4 roles here: connector and convener, leader and storyteller, designer, maker, and system thinker. And just beginning to think about roles and capabilities. The position we're taking, the sort of that role that we have at the center of the thing we're trying to do, but also the capabilities we either want to deploy or get better at, or find that we don't consider enough, and so on. So I just started putting them together on this framework and just sort of saying, okay, so actually, if you start holding a role and holding a capability together, what question do you ask? I'll get to bigger versions of these. That you can't read this, I know. But just in a way of just beginning to experiment, goes, okay, so what's the question I would ask holding that role and this capability and holding this? But then rather than doing my kind of like usual John thing, I sort of like, oh, I'll sit in this for 6 months and then eventually it will become a thing. I opened it up on the board to Andy and to Lizzie and to Rob and went, here's a start. Here's an initial thing. Here's the first kind of like draft. How can we sort of like get to better questions, smarter questions, more difficult questions? And then pairing it with this thing. So we made this viewer 5 years ago now. So it was myself and Natalie Kane were teaching at ID in Barcelona. And it was a future thinking and innovation course. And it was just a way of getting students to look at the world and go, what is this? And what is it really? How do I start pulling things out? It makes inquiries quite specific. You are getting sort of like other words out of it, other sort of like ideas. That's kind of like a glimpse of the system. But it doesn't nearly do the broadening job that we need to do for this work. But pairing that viewer with those sorts of questions becomes almost like a 2-part kit of sort of like look at something and really look at something, but then hold in place a set of questions, or even just one question, which is, I think Andy said this a few weeks ago, sort of like, some of these questions are really difficult. And you go, yes, they are very difficult, but it doesn't mean that you just have to answer it on your own. So one way of looking at it is, so there's 4 suits which are based on the 4 roles. Each suit has each of the 10 Cs within it. So you can start to sort of like just say sort of like, okay, so I can either just go in at the courage level and have the 4 courage things on the table together, or I can go in, and when we use this, and we'll speak about the RCA and stuff in a minute, you give them to people and say, of these 10 in this role, which is the most important? How do you just card sort? How do you find the priorities for you? Which questions can you answer, which questions can't? And then there's a subtler framework within it. That sort of, so within the RSA work, you have this collection here, which are more about you. And then there's a set that are about us. And then there's a set, again, that are about all of us. And I've got some, I'll pass them around so people can have a flick through if they've not seen them. But it feels like it's sort of like, whereas there's a kind of like an underlying 20th century sustainable model, which is to take the Eames thing of the best for the most for the least. You can do that within the model itself. Whereas here we're thinking about, okay, the healthiest environment for all in society with the greatest economy. And you go, this is harder. And this is bigger. And this will also take more than one actor to kind of to fix any of these things that's on. But it's the question behind all of these questions that you have to hold. And I'm still not sure about whether just holding two of those things and improving the third is fine. Like if you just keep your environmental and societal impact better, but take less resources in order to do it, is that okay? Is that good enough? Do you have to advance two? Do you have to do all three together? I don't know. But I put it in the back of every card so that everyone continually thinks about the sort of like, you turn it over and go, the bigger question behind this is this. In the kind of like experiment so far and just seeing people using it is begin to think about, this is a set of questions that needs to catalyze and not paralyze. If you feel this question is too big for you, or don't be stuck. Don't be stuck. Think about sort of like who else can help ask that question in that place. And we started, I think the first ones went to the RCA role.
Oh, is it? Oh man, I'm sorry. I can't remember the order of these. So anyway, thank you very much. And it's really nice to see many common faces that I've seen before at different times, and I've worked with your colleagues, and that's pretty awesome. So my name's Rob. I am a senior tutor on the Design Futures program at the RCA. It's quite new, and we're going, what should we be doing? My background, I've done everything from being a blacksmith, kids' toys, bulletproof jackets, working with Navy SEALs, industrial designer, pretty broad and open within the last 20 years. And I always like provoking our students. So at the moment we started to go, actually, we'll come on to what we're working on in a second, which is ecological citizenship, which is what I'm here to talk to about for a very little bit. But we started to just, I suppose it was more of a just beta, right? We put these kits together, let's give them to our students. And we started to look at things that we call public interest technologies. So if you haven't read a book by Hannah Schnack, it's really good. I mean, I think there are so many more things that need to come over in it, but basically, how can we develop and deploy public interest technologies that are either private or public, and how do they work? And it's really, really liberating when you start to think about that, because you have a commodity. So like if you start to think about examples, I don't know whether you know the project Patients Like These, really, check out, really interesting project where basically one individual started to go, hey, I suffer from cerebral palsy. How am I going to share my data so that other people can benefit from it then over time? How can we advance it really quickly? Crazy clever. They literally did in 3 years. I think they advanced, in like 3 years, they advanced 10 years of medical science or something ridiculous. I can't remember the exact numbers, but how you're trying to open things and then develop a relationship vice versa. So it's not just about public means for members of the public. It's about how we can ethically and think about redesigning, re-evolving design ethics to go, actually, this is what's happening to me privately, but now I'm able to share that publicly through a certain means or a conduit so that I can also help other people in the same situation. That starts to become really, really powerful and bring agency, which is the most important thing. So this is what we started to do, and students have started to deploy this. Some students got really confused, but we started this a couple of weeks ago, and we are pioneering, well, I'm pioneering something at the college. Quite often they keep research and teaching separately, which I completely disagree with. I think you should be doing both at the same time. You should be researching and then going, hey, look, we're doing this, try this, and then also listening to them and being reciprocal and growing with them over time. So we're currently doing that, and we'll come back to that in a minute. This is nice. Do you want to?
Oh, skip through these. These were just
pictures from yeah.
The initial kind of sort of when you gave the students the viewer, what things does it?
Yeah, and so there are so many. Yeah, and so many things came up. For example, like what is the infrastructure if you were going to rent your roof back to the council as a water catchment system to then harvest it? And they're like, the models don't necessarily exist yet for how we do that. It's like, why not? How can that work on a street level? Because there are so many different moves at every single layer. And I think that's the challenge that becomes really, really overwhelming. It did definitely for them. But that was good. So a bit of background to then sort of come into the now. So previously, about 8 years ago, I did my PhD where I was looking at open source technologies, working with beekeepers, which was brilliant because I spent 3 years eating honey, working with amazing people on the side of the South Downs. Pretty cool. And we started to look at actually what was colony collapse disorder through those technologies, because people were able to assemble their own kits. A couple of years ago, myself and a colleague called Bill Gaver, who now runs the Northumbria Interaction Research Studio, we went to the EPSRC, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, who is a brilliant academic funder, actually. And we went, hi, we want to develop some proposals to look at how young people engage, or groups of people engage, with the natural world. They went, cool. They gave us £1 million. It was a bit harder than that, but anyway. And we started to create these, which was, we called the project My Nature Watch. 3 years later, this kind of, everyone went, yeah, but it looks like you've made it on your kitchen table. It's like, yeah, because we designed it so that it would look like you made it on your kitchen table. Usually trail cameras are about 200 to 300 pounds. This one was about 35 quid to put together. Also, you could take it apart, it was fully repairable. You could use it for other things. It fitted into Raspberry Pis. We shared it so that people on forums could edit the code. And it was pretty powerful. So after 3 years, and Maddie Moat, who did some stuff on CBBS, and we did an over 60s tech group at the Design Museum. Thank you very much. That was super cool. And those respondents are now he's doing an engineering degree at age 80 because of the work he did with us. We were on BBC Spring Watch. I think we engaged about 3 million people. Also the NEP estate, we do quite a lot of work with them now. They started to use our kits to reintroduce storks to the UK. So it's like all these things were like, cool, let's try it. And everyone was terrified because actually we weren't doing lab-based research. We were doing research through what we'd created, which was really important. Anyway, the most important thing that came out of that project by one of my colleagues, Rosie Anderson, because we were doing impact work, going back and seeing how things worked. Loads of people are actually editing and changing their landscape of their gardens and their spaces because they went, I'm not getting any pictures of this. I want to get pictures of this, so I've got to attract this species. So how do I do it? So really what happened was ecological citizenship. People were starting to think about the biodiversity of their space, how they were building it over time, what they were doing, and even, which is, I don't often say, but Chris Packham turned around to us and said, man, this is a bit chuffing cool. And I'll take that. I'll definitely take that. Yeah, it's a good one, right? So now we're in this space. We've been, how long, Emily, how long have we been going this project? About 6 months? Cool. Emily is amazing. She is our network manager for Ecological Citizens. So at the end of Nature Watch, I was like, how can we do more of this? So I went to the EPSRC and went, can we have some more money? And they went, yes. So they gave us 3.4 million quid over the next 3 years. Woohoo! Yeah, academic funding, awesome. And we are working with Wrexham University and Stockholm Environmental Institute. We're many things. We're a project to make experiments, but we're a project to make projects. So conventionally, the EPSRC, we're not Arts Council funding, we're engineering funding. So we're interested in tech, deployment, social change, but kind of how we can create, their words, sorry if they're listening, sustainable digital society. Okay, that's what they viewed. And we're trying to essentially create a research area catalyzing with all these different things. And we were talking to the amazing colleagues at the RSA and all sorts of people about this. So we're kind of doing a whole host of activities over the next 3 years. We currently have our funding call out. So whilst we're also doing things ourselves, we are encouraging, I can't remember how much we're giving away initially. We've got £200,000 a year to give away in awards to try and pilot stuff, but we're also running micro projects. I think we're running with you, and thank you, to try stuff. because then we go, actually, how can we look for more cash to then catalyze other things? Okay, success is doing good stuff, or as my 7-year-old daughter Molly would say, Daddy, make it gooder, which I quite like. And yeah, we have got our first funding round. So John Alexander, who Lizzie was talking about, he's on our board. We've got the head of the Wildlife Trusts. If you don't know Pint of Science, they're pretty awesome. Priestman Good, like a whole host of people within our network. And so we want to help link people. We want to help do things. We want to help fund things. But also, if there's experiments that you're like, I don't quite know how to get my boss to try this, how like we're in. And we'll just talk about it, and we'll build, mainly because we're trying to build that space. Our deadline is the 31st of January, and we've got small grants, year-based grants, that again, you have to work and partner with a UKRI academic institution. It's not just, we can't just give money away. Mainly that's because of the way that we have to have our auditing process and things like that, which is pretty cool. So there's a lot there. But that's why we kind of went, let's try this thing and bring it in. And so we're also obviously building toolkits and all sorts of other things to kind of help build this space. So I suppose there's multiple conversations. If we can help connect you, then let us know. But we really want to try things, interesting things that you wouldn't usually get funding for. And we can quite quickly go, oh, no, just to really see actually how the space needs to move, because the EPSRC, they were really forward thinking in giving me the cash, if I'm honest, because this space is terrifying and unknown. So I wake up at 3 a.m. terrified every now and again, going, oh my God, don't mess this up. Purely because actually we're trying to go, what are the boundaries of this space? What does it look like? And I think the most important thing about citizenship is its agency and choice over things that impact you and those around you. That's what's really important. Okay, so it's not going to fit everywhere. There isn't a one size fits all. There's a certain circumstances that work in particular locations, and they might not work elsewhere. That's okay. It's not about mass producing the same thing. And I think that's something that, you know, as designers, we're like, right, quick. We have to reevaluate a lot. So yeah, anyway, cool.
Thank you, Rob. So that's a lot. But it's a lot, and it's all kind of different. It's connected, but it's different, and it's expanding. So, and back to one of the themes of kind of, I think this is, it's the broadening, and that's what I kind of want to get to from people in the room. What is next? What else does it broaden into? What resonates? What doesn't? What do people see? Because there are people from fashion, agriculture, design industries, lots of different spaces where you go, what's missing? What don't we know? What do you put your hand up and go, actually, this is also a thing. This is connected. I will open up. I'll close the screen, then we can hopefully get Lizzie on as well. If she's, I presume she's still there. She has to go back into class. But yeah. What is next? And Emily's got the box, or in fact, it's next to Liz, so that if people online will be able to hear. Thoughts?
Oh, nice. I was thinking about regenerative as in what is also applied to medicine and science, as well as agriculture, where traditionally that's where the term also evolved a lot with regenerative farming. And when it comes to futures and foresight, obviously we have the diffusion of innovation theory, which interestingly was inspired by a survey and research in agriculture, but industrial agriculture. And now we know that regenerative agriculture has much higher yields. And what can areas outside of design, such as agriculture or science, or even biomimetism, which isn't quite science, but that's what I'm really interested in. And when I look at regenerative principles and how they might be applied to future foresight. And I loved what Rob said about how it's also very contextualized and local, because we know that that's how nature works. Everything is its own ecosystem, even sometimes a small ecosystem. And so what you shared today and I don't have time to look at the cards, but I ordered a set, so I can't wait to test them. And I would say maybe, yeah, just what are the tools? Because farming is interesting in the sense that although it works very contextually to the region, the what's at stake is huge in terms of livelihood for the farmer. And so well, I think in design, when it comes to sustainability, at least in my field in fashion, there's been a lot of talk and not a lot of action. And I think it's not from bad intentions. It's all good intentions, but we don't have the tools.
Yeah.
Even just the simple tools for just a very simple action to help change the levers that we use to make decisions, even for very simple things. So that's why I love your card set, because I think sometimes we think in terms of big words, we get very wordy and all of that, but sometimes we just need really simple things whilst we're designing a product. Even Brian Eno has these like serendipity systems that he uses just in the process. And so it's about how do you translate those really big ideas into just really simple tools that we can all action, not just people in design, but then like spread it outside of people in our field.
I think that thank you. There's so much in that. One thing in particular, so learning from places where this is working first, so the kind of the agriculture and the farming angle of that. And Liz and I were actually having a conversation on Tuesday about this. Tuesday. It's a long week. But just on the sort of like going, so yes, find the diffusion of innovation, that kind of like the approaches, the different things that are tumbling over different spaces. What can you learn from agriculture? But we were having the conversation about sort of like what are the, when we think back to that question about the healthiest environment for the most for all in society with the greatest economy, how much of the societal question comes into the regenerative agriculture space? So when you think of, we were talking about the land in Lincolnshire. If you're going, we're trying to make the land in Lincolnshire as regenerative as possible. You go, well, how much of that is connected to the social elements in the Lincolnshire populace? So the people and so on, and how much is it done in sort of like a way that's kind of like managing the resources, not just on the farm itself, but all of the kind of like surrounding places and things. So sort of like finding bridges from different domains that are using this regenerative word, which, and just finding how different people consider it, how different people move these things across, so that everyone can kind of like, it's not upskill, it's whatever it is, just sort of just learning to ask the better questions, I think.
Yeah.
I had a question for Lizzie. You talked about going into companies and I guess hearing from leadership teams that they've got like an appetite for change, but a sort of structural resistance to it in the way that they, the hierarchy, the language around the hierarchies that are built into the companies. Do you have case studies or examples where leadership has changed in line with some of your kind of philosophies? And if so, what were the characteristics of the people or the companies that allowed that change to happen?
Yeah. Can you hear me again? And I heard the question, and thank you for the question. And it's a really good question. And so I think the answer is on an individual level, which is kind of where we start. The answer is yes, there's real kind of personal development and change. And I mean, it's kind of, so where we start in practice is in any session that we're facilitating, how can we help each individual person in the room feel differently so that they will think differently, so that they might be able to make different choices. And I guess the hypothesis is, if we can change how someone feels about something and get them to question kind of on a values level of what matters to them and what's important, if you can create sort of the cognitive dissonance in people between this is what I believe, I value, I know in my body and in my heart to be true, this is now at odds with this, what can I do to kind of resolve that dissonance? Then that feels like a useful place to start. And I guess because in a way we sort of operate as anti-consultants, where it's and so this is what clients will kind of say about us. If we want to be given the answer, we'll go to Bain, McKinsey, Capgemini, whoever's already in the building. But if we want to figure out the answer for ourselves, then we're more likely to call you, because the process is a self-solving process. And I guess a big part of it is helping people to realize both the responsibilities that they have, but also the enormous privilege to make different decisions. And so I would not claim in any way to be responsible for whole-scale organizational transformation, not least because I think we've only been really explicit in this work for the last 18 months. So now we're also tracking as a team how we bring this thinking into conversations and recording the responses to it, both kind of formally and informally. But I think all of the organizations that we're working with on an individual level, everyone would report sort of improvement along that. And I guess just one thing to add is that we now internally have a traffic light system in terms of our clients. So we have like red, amber, green, like with who we'll work with, and in like the reg bucket, it's very much we've just taken we don't want to work with fossil fuel companies, and undoubtedly they're part of the solution, but we're a small business and we don't want to spend our time there. And like and then there's the kind of green businesses like the Vivo Barefoots, where it's like, of course, everything you're going to do, you're already speaking this language. But where I think it's interesting is in this orange space, where essentially what we've said is the stakeholder that we're talking to saying the right words and demonstrating in some observable way their real commitment to change. And then our process is giving it a year. And if there is change within the organization, then we commit to continuing to work with that organization. And if there isn't, then it's you're a lovely person and we know, but we can't, because it's sort of an allocation of time. And again, that's now we're being transparent with everyone we work with, that this is how we operate, which means some people obviously will say we're not up for that journey and we don't want to work with you, and other people will say, so for example, we work with Coca-Cola Euro-Pacific partners. They're very definitely in that orange category. And I had a conversation with our client who's the head of comms, and she was saying, all of our management team and our board have been on the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, like the exec ed program. And she said, and we don't have a meaningful deposit scheme. So whatever is happening in that program is not creating change. And when I was talking to her about the Schumacher experience, because like this is a very alternative paradigm, but she was like, if you come back into the building and get that same team of people to do a constellations exercise and understand who's going to be curled up under the table, like by the end of the session, something might shift. And so I guess for me, kind of coming back, and I know I haven't sort of explicitly answered with the case studies, but effectively you can go to our website and everyone that we're still working with who's there, like on an individual level, it's the changes in how we feel, which is leading to different ways of thinking, which in small ways is leading to changes in behavior. And I guess the question we have to keep asking ourselves is that enough? And are we happy with that? And at what time do we have to raise the bar and do something differently because we're not going fast enough or the change isn't big enough?
So all of us take different approaches, which is really good. And that's I'm really interested to hear that stuff. But it strikes me that all of us are taking a very Anglo-Saxon model of human behavior, which assumes that individuals are the appropriate nexus to understand human behavior and therefore to generate it. Virtually every other culture around the world is social. mutual and not individualistic. I mean, I happen to have written the book about this 20 years ago, but that's not the point, is that it's very striking when you come away from this subject and then go back into it. The assumptions we've got about how people are that we want to change. It's really striking. I don't have any answer to it apart from that struck me.
I'm just thinking in answer to your provocation about that. I think that it all comes down to people's mindsets, like the right hand half of your diagram, the mindsets and the values and the understanding of what's possible. Like, so if you're brought up in an Anglo-Saxon, so I'm English, Irish, Scottish ancestry, brought up in this country mostly, that's what I'm programmed to think is possible. I'm programmed to think I'm an individual. I'm programmed for that. So one of the big questions around regenerative futures, I think, is how we loosen our mindsets and how we learn other possibilities, like how we change what we think is possible. We're deeply programmed, and we need to change our programming in order to live in a different way.
Yeah, I think it's quite often it's about how we change to becoming custodians. So it's like one thing we did in Nature Watch was we gave everything away. Like, it just became open. And everyone was like, oh my God, don't you want a pattern? I was like, no. And it became its own thing. And we had it for a short time. And then other people went, yeah, but we're going to replace it with better. I was like, great, cool, because it's achieving that. And I think that's terrifying because we still live within a commercialist, capitalist society. And so sometimes we do need to go, actually, what do we need to own? And it was something we were talking about with your colleagues, Andy, like IP within regenerative cultures that just doesn't exist. Not like Creative Commons is brilliant, it's great, it's really good, but it's not. However I say this, I'm sorry, it's not like safe investment. Like at what point do we just get past that? And I think these things is because we don't have the infrastructures for it yet. And I agree. How do you make those things investable?
I had an interesting experience yesterday, which is that I connected with someone who works in future foresight, but with the CIA. And he said something that what your comment about mapping, sorry, I don't know your name, Mark, made me think of, because he's trying to create a framework on strategic foresight for security that could be applied globally in terms of, because foresight is so important for organizations like the CIA, and actually they heavily train their agents in it. But you can't train someone in that in Poland to use the same framework. For example, in Poland, if you even use the word intelligence, you can be, fired. And
so most of our models of behavior that have been developed in the Anglo-Saxon world, North America, Northern Europe, have no space for culture. So the mind-space map that the Behavioral Insights team developed for government policy in the UK has one thing about other people. And it's sort of a little thing down the bottom. They don't like it very much because it's not cog-psych. Most of the commercial models of behavior change that you see also have no space for culture except as exceptions. So this doesn't work in China because Chinese are polite. This makes sense to you. This is the world you work in, right? And so I think we have to accept that culture is much more important as a we species than we've told ourselves being an Anglo-Saxon culture. That culture bit, and it can be variable culture in like Poland versus Germany. Germans don't use credit cards, basically. The Dutch over the border do. They love them. And Germans don't borrow in the same way the Dutch do. It's not something that's obvious until you look at it closely. So the culture is the space between people. And that's where we have to operate, in my mind, if we're going to create change, really. But starting from the space between people's ears, which is easy as an Anglo-Saxon, leaves a lot of space out. It's important, of course, how our brains work, how our minds work. It's important, but it's not the most important. And if culture is one of those things about us as a social creature, which we really have to bake into our models of change. And so I'd be really interested to see how any of those four presentations would include culture as a driver, or culture as a key factor.
I think startup culture is very keen to find and apply technology to regenerative agriculture. And I think a lot of the regen practitioners is it not? Should I get closer? Okay. So I think the startup culture is very keen to find and apply technology and apps and this and that to regenerative agriculture. And I think whereas the regenerative practitioners on the ground are all about actually, it's kind of about biology. It's not even about chemistry, right? It's about biology and understanding what's happening in the soil, what the animals are doing, what the plants are doing, how they actually work. And it's kind of like anti-technology in a way. So I think there's sometimes a tension there. And I'm having worked with accelerators, you have all these people who are like, oh, well, what do the regen farmers need? They just need money to help them transition, and they kind of need people to just let them get on with it, and they need a fair price for the stuff that they're making. So I think sometimes the helping them change isn't necessarily the things they need to help change their behavior aren't necessarily the things that the startup people want to do. So I definitely see a tension there.
Yeah, a natural follow-up, because I'm spent 25 years in technology startups, 3 as a VC, and the last 5 looking at regenerative agriculture. And I just walked here. I took a taxi. I didn't walk at all. Didn't have time. Came from Zinc VC, which is an accelerator company builder. But there you go. That's where we were. As a fellow, yeah. So I came to the same conclusions you did, which is why I'm struggling to advise the startups, because all they need is money. And my business idea at the moment is to raise funding to create a fund to invest in farms, to be partners with farms, to accelerate them to be regenerative, access to technical support, access to markets, and generally just take some of the financial burden and risk without command and control. But even thinking through that business model, my question would be, and I'm sure people in the room can help, the mindset change is critical. But what I find is, and I've found in many realms from permaculture and beyond, there's a lot of anger and sort of the system is broken. How do we fix the bloody system? And it's a bit like we need to kind of adopt the complex dynamic systems model and look at use this energy in a way that kind of changes things without trying to destroy what's already there. Because fundamentally, if I want to raise money for the fund, I'm going to go and raise money from ultra high net worths. And then I'm going to raise money from banks, right? Like Rabobank. And then I'm going to get pension funds. And these people all use fiat currency and they all use economic growth model. And I disagree with that as the way forward, but it's the only way I'm going to raise money right now, because money is our dominant model. And so I've picked probably the most complicated thing to ever do, because trying to deal with farmers and investors in the same business model is really difficult. But yeah, I just wanted to amplify that. There are globally scalable technology things like soil monitoring, which will help us with biodiversity credits and carbon monitoring and stuff. And there's satellites and there's drones, but fundamentally we already have all the solutions, and the technology is millions of years old. It's ecology and evolution. So just the question I've got then is, can anyone help with creating a regenerative economic fund, even if we start with a standard? We're going to grow, the natural capital is going to grow over time, the land will become more valuable as the soil becomes more valuable, therefore give us your money, which feels a bit kind of still based on growth. But that's all I know how to do at the moment. So if anyone's got a regenerative economics approach, that'd be great.
I haven't got an answer, but I've got more to add. Yeah, I mean, the thing I at the RSA, we've been introducing that capabilities framework to organizations. And by the way, Mark, to your point, I think when you look a bit closer at that, you'll see that those aren't all about individual capabilities, that some of those implicitly have implicitly. Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe explicitly when you start to talk about life-centered and beyond individualistic. But yeah, there's different capabilities in there around inner change versus your approach to the world. So it's not all individualistic. But what I was going to say is we've been introducing that to a lot of sort of large incumbent enterprises, and to your point around how do you get that shift to happen? My sort of conclusion after having spoke to, you know, the Unilevers of this world and so on. So like you could say the mainstream, you know, not super progressive, but could have capacity to make quite a lot of change and difference, is like, I think we're all looking for the answers. I think this is part of the problem. We're all looking for like a nice, neat answer that we can all just jump across to. Just give me the answer and let me know it's safe. And then we'll all just get there. We'll all sign up. And I know this isn't a suitable answer because it's not an answer, but I do think there's an element of bravery to all this. That's the conversations I've been having over the last 6 months. It's like, you have to actually just step into the unknown. The design of this next phase is going to be learned by designing it. So I think when we're looking for people to embrace these different models like regenerative, we have to go into them knowing that we actually just don't have a neat and tidy investment friendly answer to you right now. And that's really hard, right? Like it's almost impossible. But I actually don't personally at the moment, I'm sort of caught in this catch-22 where I can't see a way forward that doesn't involve embracing the bravery and the uncertainty of like getting a cohort of people together who can make that change happen and stepping into that unknown. And businesses just aren't oriented to do that at the moment.
Thank you. Oh, Liz then.
I just good throw. I wanted to respond to what you said about Unilever. I think about this a lot. You know, if we want to make big change, we need the Unilevers of the world to get on board, but they have so much to lose, right? So how do you get them to step into the unknown, to take that risk? I think that's really hard. It's really hard.
So two things. I think one, technology is a pencil, right? It doesn't always need to be massive loads of tech. You're like, you know, you've gathered materials, you put it together, you use it in a certain context. Brilliant. So I think it's really important that we talk about it as contextual and appropriate for its situations and how it's used, like a postage stamp, that's technology. The other thing is like, so I do quite a bit of work with NEP. They didn't really, when Charlie Burrell, like, they didn't really know what rewilding was. They knew started to like, but they did it, and then they started to get funding for it, and then it started to become a thing. Now it's one of the most over subscribed tourist destinations by loads of people coming to see what's going on there. So I think sometimes there is this like suck it and see, how do you build, having a framework to do it and try it. And it is that terrible when, like, how do you not solve it? How do you just start and move it forwards? And what is the right thing? And who are the right organizations? And it's a bit like, again, in some of the most biodiverse rich areas are actually on Salisbury Plain. They're tank ranges. Why? Because no one goes there. Like, and so sometimes, yeah.
Two things to finish off, because I realize it's 2:15. So first thing on the NEP thing and on the agriculture thing, to your point about some of that, there's something, and Liz and I talked about this. There's kind of like this old trope from Viz of farmers being, get off my land. There's a social dimension to some of this, which is get on my land.
Yeah, exactly.
It's sort of like, this is the whole nature doesn't mind whose land it is, etc. But sort of like, how do you involve more local communities in the land itself to say, so this is what we're trying, and that, what does that do? It does connect people more with the land that's around it, but it also connects them more with the kind of like, if you want a fair price for food, one way to do that is to make people emotionally connect with where the food comes from. So we live about 40 miles from NEP, but my wife now buys the NEP meat boxes over other sort of options and so on, because it's like, we've been there and we've seen that and so on. So connect people with that in one way. And then to the wider challenge about how you connect this stuff. I've this, I think I've told some of you this before, but I've this term floating around in kind of like my head, not knowing what to do with it for about 8 years, of least modernism. How do you harness the kind of the early 20th century excitement around modernism and what it means to make and live in the future, with the idea of doing less, the least you can, within that framework of the kind of like the healthiest environment for all in society, with the greatest economy, meaning that in the sort of like, what's the thing that I can do is least extractive? what is this least modern system we can get to, and how do you get people to buy into that as a vision, a vibe, a mood? The bravery Andy speaks to. I'm going to leave everyone with that as a thought. Thank you, everyone, online and here, and our speakers. Lizzie's had to go. She's back. She's back sorting regenerative finance. It'll be solved by this afternoon. It'll be all fine. Give yourself a big round of applause. Thank you.